Welcome everybody. I'm Michael Ben. I'm the founder of the Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy Facebook groups. I'm a psychoanalyst based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you all for joining us. The discussions are going to be hosted by Andrew and Enda, two of the moderators from the Facebook groups. And today we're going to conclude our series of interviews with the co-authors of Lacan and Race with Professor Todd McGowan. Todd is a professor of film studies at the University of Vermont. He is author of Capitalism and Desire, Emancipation After Hegel, Only a Joke Can Save Us, Universality and Identity Politics, and he has a podcast called Why Theory, with lively discussions on Hegel, Freud, and Lacanian ideas and concepts. And he also has a very active and good, nice YouTube channel that I'll post a link to on the group. So Todd, it's nice to have you with us.
Michael, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Looking forward to a lively discussion. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic, so to say, on to Andrew and Enda. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hey. Hi, Todd.
Hey.
Thanks for being on with us here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to ask, how did you get involved in this project on the book Lacan and Race?
So I've known one of the co-editors, Sheldon George, for quite some time, and he talked to me. He just happened to say something to me when we were together one time about this edited collection he's working on. He just said, "You wouldn't happen to have anything for that?" And I said, "Well, it just so happens like I'm writing a book on Lacan and racism, or racism and fantasy, really." And so I do have something, and so that's basically how I just jumped. He had the project, I just jumped on board. So it was he. I think he originated it. He would know better than me, but talking with Derek Cook, the co-editor, with him, I think they together came up with it.
Yeah, and we did an interview with them as well as a few other folks who contributed to the book, and it's been really interesting. Certainly, it's really I've been asking just a general question about not just your essay, but in terms of the view about the project in general. Like, how do you see this Lacanian analytic or Lacanian, let's call it intellectual apparatus, particularly helpful? I mean, you do talk about it in a way in your essay as something of a different approach than let's say the standard approach of dealing with race and racism. It's not so much that it's better necessarily, but what does it help us? I'm speaking now very generally, to begin to understand the structure of race and race, the persistence of it. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this isn't specifically Lacan, but psychoanalysis in general. I just think that the idea of the unconscious, like to explain, just like what you were saying, the persistence of racism without thinking about the unconscious. So the way in which all these efforts at knowing, at changing consciousness, that how they come up short. So it seems to me like you have to have some understanding of the unconscious. And it's interesting, a lot of the more mainstream anti-racist movement, there is some sense of like you hear this term unconscious bias, like even Hillary Clinton uses that term.
Right.
But what's interesting to me about that is that even the term bias, it suggests it's a problem in knowing and not what I say is it's not that racism isn't a failure of knowing, but a success at enjoying. So and I think that's where I'm giving away the Lacanian emphasis for me, that Lacan's emphasis on enjoyment really, I think, allows us to understand how racism gets a hold of us in a way that focusing just on the way in which we know and our knowledge is askew, that misses that element, I think.
Right. And you get into it in the essay that where in the first section let me see if I can find where you really have some very strong, some strong sentences. For example, you say, we enjoy at odds with how we know. That is to say, we enjoy not in spite of knowing better, but because we know better.
Right.
Furthermore, the unconscious isn't simply a lack of knowledge. It is what one does without being able to know it prior to acting. The unconscious acts ahead of our knowledge. Racism is not the result of a bias in our knowing, but rather we have a bias in our knowing because of racism. Now, that led me to a couple things. Like when we say knowing, the racism is not the result of a bias in our knowing, but rather we have a bias in our knowing because of racism. Is that suggesting that it's, in a sense, something like a Heideggerian sense, that we're thrown into this culture and history as such? We're born into it, we're thrown in, and then in a sense, everyone is in a sense traumatized by that. So there's an already existing social fabric. So that is to say, it's already filled with racism and various forms. And is that, in a sense, what you're driving at, in the sense that it's because of racism that this unconscious, forms with, it's a very basic developmental sense of how the unconscious forms in a person's personality.
Right.
It's that where, it is installed through language, and I'm speaking very generally here, the Oedipal process, or in more Lacanian terms, the process of acquisition of language, the weaning away from the mother or the parental figure, all of that process engages a subjectivity starts to develop, and there's still an antagonism of in Lacanian terms of the subject development and language and symbolic other, etc. So is that what we're driving at? That in a sense, when you're saying racism is not the result of a bias in our knowing, but rather we have a bias in our knowing because of racism. In other words, racism already pre-exists our ability to know what it is.
That's right. That's right. So I think this is Lacan's idea, and if it's not, I wish that it was. Then that the very thing that you're describing is already structured around a mode of enjoying, right? So that there's not like that, and I think this is where Lacan is different from someone like Habermas, right? Like that signify, or even Heidegger, actually. Like I think that signifying structure is already oriented in to provide subjects who take up a certain kind of identity enjoyment from it. And so that's why I would say the racism is prior to our structure of knowing. Like it's inserted in there, that way of enjoying is inserted in there prior to any way that we have of knowing the world. And then our knowing the world follows from that, right? Like it follows from, so we know, I would say we know in a way that derives from the way that we find enjoyment.
Mm-hmm. And you're using the word enjoyment, which is a slight, I just want to touch on this a little bit.
Yeah, good.
Because it's a little different than in our master, whatever, Lacan himself.
Yeah. Because,
and it's a little bit of an Americanized usage, which I don't really object to, but sometimes I just always feel like we need to clarify it slightly because, it comes out of the term jouissance, and jouissance, in, just for audience sake, in Lacan, without getting into great detail here and how it relates to the real and all of this, it's more than simply enjoyment, like going to see a baseball game or watching something on Netflix. It has to do with this pleasure pain that at a further level than simply, like I said, watching a baseball game rather passively or being excited about your team or something like that. It's a very, the metaphor, or rather the famous phrase he once said, is that it starts with a tickle and can become a flame, a total fire. So that jouissance has this potential of like really extreme over the top level. It's a really specifically different dynamic than what we in American vernacular usually mean by enjoyment.
Right. I think that's right, Andrew. And I think you're right that there's a risk with this translation. And in fact, there are several people that, like Nestor Brownstein wrote this book called Jouissance, and there's like a diatribe against anybody that translates it as enjoyment. So I get it. I guess I think it's worth taking the time using. I'm so against jargon that I feel like if you're importing the word from the French, then they're already certain people feel like, okay, you've created this thing that's jargony. And so I don't know. I mean, I think you're right. There's a cost to that translation, but I try to spend a lot of time in most of the things I write detailing the difference between what I would call enjoyment and then pleasure. And I think that, which covers that like suffering or sacrifice that has to be included in enjoyment, like in the sense of jouissance. And so I think it's worth like taking the time to clarify what you mean by the English word rather than sticking with the French word. But I could be wrong about that. Right.
No, just with that, because then it gets a little bit too much into theory, and that we have to discuss this where we talk about the real and the impossible. Because my error is always going to be to be not jargony. Right. So that's just okay. But let's go further, because just to touch on this again, the issue that you're initially start with the essay, and you mentioned it earlier, is that what is crucial really is not to be bogged down in a question of that we don't have good knowledge. That the question, this is my own language, not the way you put it, is not a question of that we should have better knowledge of the structure of racism necessarily, but that we have to understand what the enjoyment, to use this language, of racism and how that works, right? Am I correct?
I think that explains the attachment to it, right? Like that, the way it operates clearly against people's interest in a lot of cases, right? And so I think that, to me, if you can't see how it attaches to people in a way that is beyond what they consciously will, then I think, if racism was just confined to the people in Charlottesville saying they will not replace us and Blut and Bowdoin, then there wouldn't be the kind of problem with racism that we have, right? Like it includes primarily people that don't think they're racist. So I think you have to then say, like, what's the attachment? Like, what's the nature of the attachment? And I think that's where psychoanalysis is helpful.
Right. So how does that then, when you go on here that every society relies on a foundational racist fantasy, every society that has structural racism does, you go on, it has primacy because it provides a way of organizing enjoyment for the members of a society that enables them to sustain the image of an unlimited and complete satisfaction.
Yeah.
So you're organizing it around the issue of lack, and that this fantasy in particular allows for an overcoming of the problem of lack.
Right.
Now, how does that differ from, say, structurally in a way, are we saying that it's equal to, say, someone having a addiction to porno, let's say, or is it more or less on a if we were to structure, it has different implications, of course.
Right.
But from a certain structural point of view, is it then operating the same way?
Sure. I mean, the difference is that I think that pornography seems to implicate the other differently than racism does, for sure. I mean, right. I guess the other thing is that racism, to me, racism requires the image of the fully enjoying other, and maybe porn does too. I mean, it'd be an interesting question. Does an addiction to porn require a similar image? Maybe, but and maybe that an addiction to porn generates sexism in a way that's parallel to the way that racism functions. Maybe I haven't thought of that. It's an interesting question. I hadn't thought of it. But I do think that you're right to say that there's an image of a non-lacking, fully enjoying other that exists maybe in both cases. So that is at least a parallel, I think, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the other key thing is that it's dependent in a strange way, which I think maybe you could elaborate on this pivot point thing. It depends upon that the obstacle remains there. So it keeps the structure in a certain way having a kind of visible presence. This is what I think is a little bit interesting. And it's somewhat touched upon in your essay, but I felt like it's a little unclear.
Yeah, That's really good, Andrew. Yeah, in fact, in my book, The Racist Fantasy, which is going to come out later, I'm not trying to pimp it, but that I really go into this sense of the obstacle and it's the need for it, right? And so the point is that the racist enjoys through the obstacle because the obstacle is the racial other, and that obstacle allows you to believe that beyond the obstacle, there's some full kind of enjoyment that's available, right? And so once the obstacle is eliminated, then the absence of any full enjoyment becomes evident. So you need to sustain the obstacle. And I find most interesting in this way, the way in which the Nazis, the more that a place got rid of all the Jews, the more anti-Semitic that location became, right? So getting rid of the obstacle makes one do whatever one can to recreate the obstacle, right? So the more that because the obstacle that, and I think this is, Lacan never really says that, although I think it's his concept of objet really is all about this, but he never says that it's the obstacle that brings enjoyment in the fantasy. But I think that is, I think basically that's what he thinks. And I think that's really the key thing to understand how racism functions, that racism erects this racial other obstacle, and then it does whatever it can to sustain that obstacle because the enjoyment would just fall apart if the obstacle was overcome. So there's no way that a racist can ever eliminate all the racial others. Like no racism can ever be successful. It's a implicitly, inherently losing strategy, right? Because that's the very way in which the enjoyment is structured. Right.
And then it gets into a strange thing, which you don't so much touch in, but the implication is also, how do we, I get confused here in the sense of, like, if we're talking about sometimes what seems to me, I'll call liberal patronizing kinds of efforts to be anti-racist, but in a way reinscribe a certain kind of assumptions of racism. Mm-hmm. And then in a way are restructuring the structure of race in a funny, strong way. It seems to me, I often, maybe I'm projecting, but I see a certain way of behaving, sometimes by well-meaning whites to Black people, that seems to me, frankly, rather kind of a reflex of treating the other as a kind of Aunt Jemima, a sort of overly, a certain notion of being extra nice and extra sweet, and assuming a mirroring back of extra sweetness and and I sometimes think that itself is a form of this reenactment of racism from another side. Absolutely. That can't really be accused of racist because it's not oppressing anyone, but it's sort of.
But it's part of the same logic, right, Andrew? I mean, that's the thing, right? Like it's part of the same fantasy. I think that's, that's in a way, you're right. I don't really talk about that in the essay, but that's a lot of what I've written and trying to write about, right? Like that very thing that, like, I have a friend, it's a white friend who will, like, goes out of her way to befriend everyone who's not white, right? Like that's just, so it's this, and it's like the effort, just like you said, is really and it's obvious to everyone involved except this person. And I think you're right. Like it's patronizing, it's all these things, but I think the thing that it is most of all is that it buys into this idea that the racial other has this enjoyment that this person, by befriending them, can access, right? So in a way, like, of course that's better than like joining the KKK, but in a certain sense, it's the same kind of phantasmatic logic, I think. So that
it often has an exotification. Sometimes it seems to me like they're more natural or more, something like that.
Yeah.
Often.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe Edna, you have some thoughts. I can certainly continue, Todd. It's very enjoyable to discuss, but maybe Edna has some things to introduce here.
Sure. I think you're muted.
Oh, Edna, I think you're muted.
Sorry, yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, Just following on from that, I think one thing that you wrote about in the essay, Todd, was about breaking the hold of the fantasized figure of the racial other.
Mhm.
And this relates to non-belonging. So
Right.
I was kind of just wanted to bring this in at this point. This requires a distinguishing between real enjoyment, and this real enjoyment is, you say that it derives from non-belonging.
Right.
And so this non-belonging is an enjoyment available to everyone, since none of us truly belong.
Right.
And that gets to the point as well as like, oh, should I speak about race? Maybe I'm the wrong race to speak about race.
Right.
Yeah? I think we just kind of touched on that before. But
yeah, I think that's a really important point, that like to think like, oh, I can't speak about race because I'm one who actually does belong, is to buy into the very fantasy itself of belong. Like that's you're like repeating the problem, because you believe in your own belonging, when the whole point is that, and I think this is where this notion of like the inherent failure of the social structure, or the inherent failure of interpolation, right? Like I think this kind of touches on Slavoj Žižek's critique of Althusser, right? That we're not really interpolated successfully as a certain symbolic identity. Instead, subjectivity is the name for that failure to be successfully interpolated. So I think if it were true that someone really belonged, they would be successfully interpolated as a subject, and that can't happen precisely because there's an unconscious, precisely because there's a way in which the subject is always at odds with itself and can't ever respond. Like you can try to capitulate fully to the demand made on you, but there's always going to be, I think Lacan is very good on this, there's always going to be some desire in you that's beyond that demand, that doesn't fit with that demand, and that is always going to, and that's unconscious, and that always is going to undermine it. So I think that this is really the point, that once you see non-belonging as universal, then everyone is then required to talk about racism, not that, it doesn't touch me, so no, it touches you because you're part of you don't belong too. Yeah.
I think the non-belonging as well, we can relate it to something in psychoanalysis, which the idea which you spoke of unconscious bias can never get to, and that's a radical otherness.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think that, and like the way Freud talks about the unconscious as the other scene, like I don't think unconscious bias has a sense of unconscious as the other scene, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And being structured in a certain way.
Right.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit, sorry to pick up on where you guys are going with this, is that you're mentioning the sort of space of non-being, and it reminded me certainly of Fanans' zone of non-being, which he famously only touched upon a little bit. But nonetheless, it's very much, of course, about the at that time period, the break from the colonial era into the beginnings of the struggles against the imperialist order in various places. Algeria, for example. And he's very much focused on the dialectic of the place of zone of non-being. And I wanted to just draw out that, in a sense, while I wonder what you think about, like, in a sense, we can all identify with, because we all do have a certain relation in this Lacanian sense, existentially speaking, so to say, of non-being. But in fact, without using or getting too heavily along the lines of privileged, we are nonetheless, there are certainly different in American culture, let's say, orders or structures. Like I certainly enjoy American access in American culture to jobs and such, that if I were an immigrant from Mexico who doesn't speak as well, unless I'm a already trained engineer or something, it's unlikely that I'm going to be able to move as freely, let's say, speaking generally now. So this is I'm speaking very commonly, but the point is this zone of non-being, particularly within the dynamics of racism, is going to be quite different. So, it's, while I can relate to a person of color, in the sense that I too can never fully belong, but it's simply not the same. It's not like we're in, we're not, there is a certain radical difference because of the trauma of the history and different things that have occurred.
Yeah, I guess I would just distinguish between what's not the same, right? Like, I think you're absolutely right that there's a particular difference in terms of your symbolic position, right? Like your symbolic position relative to your position within the social order relative to the let's say the immigrant who, let's say, doesn't speak the native language as well, right? So yeah, definitely your symbolic position is different, but I think isn't what's universal is precisely the non-belonging, right? Like I just think like that's the thing that's universal. Like it's not that yet, like, yeah, there's tons of particular difference in terms of how you're socially situated, but the point of failure, I guess, I think it's important to see that that's universal, and that's I think it's really important that is the site of enjoyment, right? Like there's no enjoyment in there's a certain, and then here I think your insistence on jouissance here I think is important. Like I think there's no enjoyment in the sense of jouissance. There's pleasure in like symbolic position, symbolic status, but there's no enjoyment in it. And I think that all the enjoyment comes from the points of fissure, the points of failure within the symbolic structure. And so I think that's why, like that seems to me what's universal. And I don't think that like, of course, like people suffer differently, right? Like people, but again, I think but what's universal is this failure to belong. And that's, I don't think that's a register of like how much someone has suffered. It's just a structural failure, right? That non-belonging can't be like, you can't, to believe that you like, oh, like this is, I guess, my problem with even the term white privilege. I grant that, of course, there's certain, obviously it's an advantage not to be killed by a cop, right? Like there's an advantage, but it does strike me as a little bit strange to think like, oh, you can have a kind of blindness to structural racism, and that's a privileged position. Like that seems wrong to me to think that that's privileged. So I'm, and I also think there's a whole kind of liberal, like it's a kind of liberal individualism around the term white privilege that I think is a problem as well. It
somehow seems logically incoherent. Also, that's another thing. It'd be like as if you go to a hospital and are treated for a broken arm, and then you learn that another part of the world that they don't have hospitals, and so people have a broken arm, they're not able to get it, as if that would be a privileged thing.
Right.
It's a strange logic to me.
Yeah.
I think there's two things going on here, because we're talking about real social discrimination, and then we're talking about something which relates to the trauma of racial history. And I think it's important to make the distinction that the trauma of racial history is the trauma of the signifier.
Right.
It's not something that's grounded in being on some kind of genetic or intergenerational level, but it's a problem of the signifier.
I think that's such a great point, and Sheldon makes this point a lot in his earlier book, Trauma and Race, and in his essay here, I think. But I think it's interesting that I would say that trauma of the signifier is a response, like isn't I think racism, I would say, is a failure to take up some kind of existential trauma. And so you're failing to do it. And so you adopt a racist position as a way to say, I'm going to, and this is a point Sheldon makes really great. Like, I'm going to put off all the suffering of existence onto you, and I'm going to try to enjoy and just hoard the enjoyment for myself. And basically he says that's the psychodynamic of slavery. Like I'm going to hoard all the enjoyment for myself and put all the suffering on you, but it never works out that way, right? Like you can't, because I think Lacan is right about this. There's no enjoyment without suffering, right? So when you try to deprive yourself of the suffering, you deprive yourself of the enjoyment as well. And thus you end up in these situations where you're envying the enjoyment of the people that you've condemned to suffering, right? Even though that seems like totally bizarre.
It's
Right,
almost as
yeah.
you structurally, that's where you get to the obstacle thing. So to make the obstacle work, you have to make them have special qualities.
That's right. That's absolutely right, Andrew. A special relation to enjoyment, right? Like
Right.
that's where all these like in white racist society, like this fantasy of black male sexual prowess, right? Like that Fanon is, I think, phenomenal on this idea, right? And
Or black women are very soulful, or
right, that too, right? Exactly. So all those things come up, like as this obstacle, and that's blocking the one who's invested in the racist fantasy from getting to the enjoyment.
Yeah, but it also has an illegitimate quality to it. Yeah,
that's right. That is absolutely right. And I think that's pretty interesting that, the essay has the joy of the lynch mob or whatever in the title, right? Yeah. Like that to me is really where you can see this in the Klan lynching. Like, I think that really kind of shows this logic to a T, because the point is that the illegitimacy of the enjoyment can't be, it's so illegitimate that you can't rely on legitimate authority to put it down, right? Like, that's the whole point of a lynch mob, right? Like the regular authority in the town or wherever in the state is insufficient to counter that enjoyment. So we need this extra legal, extra state mob. Yeah.
So the obstacle is to blame for both the subjects, not just the subject's failings, but the society's failings.
That's right. Which is it's fascinating the way this could win the next presidential election in France, right? Like it's this very way of thinking. It's like on display. It seems to me like it's on display throughout the world today. Mm-hmm. It's nice. I mean, the only thing that Eric Zamore makes me feel good that America isn't like we're not going to have the worst leader maybe after that. But it's a
Let me ask you a question here, because this gets to something you mentioned very briefly in your essay here. You mentioned about that this fantasy becomes especially necessary in the capitalist universe. Without the racist fantasy, people in capitalist society would lose faith in the image of total satisfaction. Excuse me. Racism keeps the image of an unlimited satisfaction alive by erecting the racial other as a barrier to it. And I bring that up, and it certainly echoes with Trump's way of, at times, certainly talking about Mexicans in a very racist way, et cetera. And before that, his very racist things about black people, and certainly onwards throughout his regime. But okay, but forget about Trump for a moment, or Le Pen in France. And nonetheless, I'm wondering, because it echoes a little bit that Lacan, famously, for Lacanians, maybe not so famous, but somewhat prophesized that with the rise of what he called the capitalist discourse, you're going to see a greater explosion of racism. And he only left it as a kind of hanging thought that he didn't really develop. Second of all, he only mentioned, as you know, the capitalist discourse in one, really one. I mean, he did talk about it earlier, but he only really went into it. And he talked, as you know, very biblical about it. It's like his metaphor is like the locusts in the Old Testament.
It's only in the Milan discourse, though, right?
That he goes at that length, although he does talk about it. Really, he does a number of times. In that period, roughly 16 to roughly on 10 minutes Renaissance. So stops talking about it around then. But in any case, what am I driving at here is that I'm wondering, I know that in recent podcasts, and I only heard briefly it, so I didn't really have time to really think about it, although it startled me. You, I must say, you were rather critical of the discourse theory. I know you have a sort of criticism of it. So I don't know that this may take too much time for you to elaborate on it. But I'm wondering if you could relate to how you see this, as maybe you don't have a problem with the idea that there is a greater capitalist domination of the social fabric now, but maybe you wouldn't call it capitalist discourse. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. That's just it, right? Of course I think there's a total capitalist domination of the social fabric. I just don't think that there's another discourse, but I think that's a little bit of a side thing. But I think your question is really to the point. Like, I think that I would even say that there cannot be a capitalist anti-racism for this reason, because the capitalist fantasy depends upon the idea that I can at least have sometime the promise of finally getting the object, like sometime in the future. And the problem is, of course, that if you're living in capitalist society, you encounter this dissatisfaction after dissatisfaction. Even Jeff Bezos, right? Like that's why he has to go into space to say, okay, maybe I'll find the satisfaction up there that I haven't found down here. But he doesn't find it, right? He finds it for a couple seconds and it's gone. So I think that this is where racism gets inserted into it necessarily to say like, oh, why aren't I finding that satisfaction within this capitalist world? Oh, it's the racial other blocking my path to enjoyment or jouissance, and that's the source of the problem. So I think that those two fantasies, the one from capitalism and the racist fantasy, fit so perfectly together. And my wager is you can't even have capitalism without racism, because it handles all the dissatisfaction that capitalism necessarily produces, not just among the losers, but even among the winners. Right? Like I had my doctor was once a doctor to the rich and famous. He said, you wouldn't believe it. Like the amount of Prozac I prescribed to them was like 10 times as much in a normal like Vermont community. So I think we were wrong to think the winners somehow have it easier psychically. I think they have it just, if not worse, just as bad under capital. And so that's where racism has a real appeal, not just to the poor, but to the wealthy as well, because it explains to them their own failure of satisfaction. Like, why aren't I getting it? Oh, it's that's.
Mm-hmm.
But I totally agree. From my position, I agree with you. In relationship to Marx, I think we can actually read into Marx, into Capital, especially the chapters on primitive accumulation. We can actually read that race itself is built into the foundational structuring of Capital.
It's interesting. Don't you think it's interesting the way in which Marx has, like that? But he did. I think that's right. But don't you think that Marx did think that? I mean, I think his view on slavery wasn't exactly right? Like that he saw slavery as a holdover and not as actually an invent. Like I think modern race slavery is an invention of capitalist modernity. It's not some kind of holdover from the feudal regime. And I think Marx did think that. Like I think
Is that how he marked it, really? Because in Grundrisse, I mean, I haven't read that set, because in Grundrisse he has a whole very interesting way of how he maps out the early period from feudal into what we call, the industrial era, very beginning. The whole thing of like the feudal, they threw the people off the land, and then within a generation and a half, more or less, they re-employed them, but this time as alienated workers in these beginning factories. And so that was the beginning of the new alienated working class that were, all worked in a mass society way. So that's his argument, that it was like
right. I know, but I just don't. Is there a discussion of slavery in the Grundrisse? I don't think so, right?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah.
My point is that he does this he sees it as a kind of like thermodynamic turnover thing.
Yeah. That's really good. So I'm probably wrong about the dynamic of it. It's just interesting to me that the doxa on that, I think among Marxists today, at least the ones I know, is now that slavery was integral to the inauguration of capitalism, not some kind of like remnant that was going to be necessarily gotten rid of.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. That was the only point I was making.
Mm-hmm. I was kind of making the point that basically the idea that land and that those resources are already seen as commodity forms in the capitalist structuring. And in that way, the other is racialized as non-belonging. So in the
other that's on the land.
Yeah. So I'm just kind of think of it in that way. But in a way, I want to go back to this idea of the enjoyment of non-belonging. So this is an enjoyment of the status of lacking.
Yep.
Can you just say something about that people who might not understand lack in Lacan, what would the enjoyment of the status of lacking be?
So I think that for Lacan, that's the only enjoyment there is, right? And I think the idea is, and I think I find I've always been really blown away by this idea that it's because we're lacking beings that we can become excessive, or that we are inherently excessive beings. So Lacan links the fact that we're lacking, so that because we don't have, so for him, lack is because of our relationship to language, right? So we're always desiring something else, something that's not present, right? Desire structured around what's absent. And as a result, he thinks we can excessively attach ourselves to objects because we don't have just an object that can perfectly satisfy our desire. There's no present object for us that's satisfying, and so we excessively attach ourselves to different things, and that's how we enjoy excessively. So, like, think about the way in which it can be really like overeating at Thanksgiving, for instance, or you don't have Thanksgiving's not an international holiday, but overeating at the holidays, or going out and eating a huge piece of, or like indulging in a weekend of sex, or like all these kind of things, like where the excess of it is, that's like it's driven by the fact that I'm lacking. So that it's those two things are inseparable. And I think that's how, for me, that's how I understand enjoyment, that it's tied to lack, but it's excessive out of that.
Okay, so it's real enjoyment.
Yeah. This would be the sense of real enjoyment.
Yeah, as opposed to desire.
Opposed to something like fantasy? Imaginary enjoyment, this kind of like racist enjoyment that you imagine the other to be having, right? Like I think for Lacan, it's very important for him, this distinction between that real enjoyment is always partial, and that the fantasy of enjoyment is always like this full enjoyment that's non-lacking. So that would be the difference.
So the importance here is always how we relate to lack.
That's
instead
right.
of covering it up with the fantasy structure.
Right. That's what I would say. Right. That like, can we embrace, I was at this conference, Psychology and the Other, and Sheldon George was giving a talk, and someone said, well, what's the anti-racist strategy? What should we do? And he just said 3 words. He's like, enjoy your lack. That's what he said. So I thought that was pretty great. Yeah, that was pretty good.
Okay, so that takes us on kind of nicely to this idea I wanted to put to you is, so the subject's relation to lack is the enjoyment of non-belonging.
Yes.
But then again, in Lacan, there's always the second lack. It's not just the lack in the subject, but it's the lack in the other. And I just wanted to mention to you, obviously, from the book itself, Jennifer Friedlander's, in her chapter on medium race, speaking about traversing of the fantasy. Now, this is kind of a little bit of a vexed question to you. Okay. So I'm just saying, Jennifer, she actually kind of argues, in a sense, critiques a little bit Sheldon's position, where Sheldon's position, according to Jennifer, is to take a critical distance from the lack in the other, whereas Jennifer says that actually the way to go about this really is through an identification. Yeah. So the traversal comes with an identification rather than the cynical distance. And the problem I think Žižek often says about the cynical distance, you end up supporting the perverse fantasy through the distancing. Right. So if you wanted to say something on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. So to see I think to identify with the lack in the other, that is to see the way in which the other is necessarily lacking, right? Like that the other doesn't have. So then I think the implication of Jennifer's point is that the other doesn't have this, can't function as an obstacle, because the other isn't replete with enjoyment like you fantasize them being, right? So once you identify with the lack in the other, then your you're freed from this image of the fully enjoying other. You know, so Slavoj Žižek loves to tell this. I'm just going to tell it again because he's stolen this joke from someone else himself. So a patient goes into analysis, and this I think speaks directly to your point. Like a patient goes into analysis, and believes that has the fantasy that they're a seed. And, you know, they work through their analysis, and they're like, okay, I realize I'm a man, I'm not just a seed. And the problem is that as they believe they're a seed, they're worried that some chicken would eat them as they're walking down the road. And so they leave their analysis, they think they're cured. And then the guy comes back to the analyst the next day and is like, oh, no, I'm back into my old anxiety. And the analyst goes, what happened? You know, you're a man, not a seed. And he goes like, yeah, that's true. I know I'm a man, I'm not a seed, but does the chicken know? Right. And that is exactly what Jennifer's talking about, right? Like, does the chicken know? And the point is, no, the chicken knows too. The chicken knows that you're a man and not a seed as well, right? Like, that's the point. Like, to see the way in which the lack is also out there in the other, not just in yourself, right? Like the racist, and I think it's interesting, right, Edna? The racist has no problem seeing their own lack, right? But they think that it's overcomeable precisely because they view this non-lacking enjoyment in the other. Right. Yeah.
Again, Jennifer kind of goes into this description to describe that. She talks about Spike Lee's film in relationship to this kind of, it's almost like an over-identification where you identify with the lack in the other, but in a way, this kind of subverts the fantasy.
That's right.
Because it exposes the lack in the other. Yeah?
That's right.
So
I think that's absolutely right.
Okay. So this point I find really intriguing, you know.
Yeah.
Because I
agree. I think it's really. I hope that she develops that further, actually, into like I think it might actually become a whole book. So.
Okay, I see. Brilliant. Yeah. Okay.
When we talked about, like, here we're getting a little bit into the problem here is like we're talking about it's not just a matter of here's a sort of a question I have. It's not simply a matter of like individuals raising consciousness. Ultimately, it's you mentioned that it's a shared social structure rather than the product of certain individuals when we're talking about this. So in terms of, let's call it enlightenment towards so it's not about necessarily just becoming aware, because we were talking about earlier, a matter of becoming aware to separate from the racist fantasy. That's where again this question becomes in terms of the anti-racist movement in general and what's active today. Because in a way, part of what your essay is doing, and you're not alone in it, is critiquing some of that's not, you're not doing it in a kind of thoroughgoing way, but there is a critique of some of the tendencies in the anti-racist movement towards just a matter of having better knowledge, of like learning about, say, white fragility or different things to become consciously aware of. And I grasp that it's not that you're saying exactly just throw that all out.
No.
Right.
No, that's I think it's fine as far as it goes, right? It's fine. I just think where, I guess my point would be, where does the rubber meet the road? It's not on that question of like white fragility or whatever. But I do think like that your point, a couple points, Andrew, I think are really good that you're making. Like on the one hand, it's not just this individual struggle, like I think it can't be just like, oh, I'm going to try to wipe out all the racism in me and then that'll benefit society somehow. I just think that's absurd, right? Like that's a very liberal conception of what anti-racist struggle would be. But I also think one way to think of it in terms of changing the relation to the fantasy is taking responsibility for your own enjoyment. Like I think that just if you had to like boil down what I think anti-racist fight would be, that would be it. Like take responsibility for your own enjoyment, because isn't what racism does is it shuffs off the enjoyment onto the racial other and says, it's not me who's enjoying, they are the ones that enjoy, not me. I'm just here lacking subject, right? So I think that taking responsibility for your own enjoyment seems to me to be the has to be the kernel of an anti-racist struggle.
So,
but yeah.
So in a sense, you're not trying to get rid of the obstacle, yeah?
Right. Like, but to see the obstacle as yours, right? Like it's my obstacle, right? It's not that the racial other stands as this obstacle for me. It's that I am the obstacle. Like I'm the source of the obstacle.
Yeah,
right?
and the obstacle is that radical otherness, which gives
right.
you liberation from the structuring of the fantasy.
That's right.
Yeah. So okay, so going on from the idea from what we mentioned, that we can say the obstruction of the racial other, it seems to be what is to blame, yeah? Once we're entrapped in fantasy, it's what is to blame for the subject's failings and also for society's failings.
That's right.
So in a sense, looking at non-belonging, can we think about a society, a way of a social relation or a subject formation that didn't have some kind of positive attribute of identity as a source of the group's social relation?
Yeah, Edna, it's a great question. I mean, I think that there's no way to have no identity, but I think we can take up a different relation to identity, right? Like, I think that's the whole, to me, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an analyst proper. I'm just a patient, but to me, the whole idea is that we like understand that the symbolic identity is empty, right? Like that, and I think once you, so that there still have to be symbolic identities available to people. Like there have to, otherwise I don't know about you, but I can't imagine a social structure that didn't have symbolic identities. I don't think that's just particular capital or something. I think that's just the nature of the social structure. But to see it as a form and not a that would be one way I would say it, like to see it as a form and not a content, right? To see because once you see it as just a form and you're not blinded by the content, then I think you're freed from the trapping power of that identity. And in a certain way, I think this is really it's one way that the Freudian psychoanalytic project and the Marxist project are intimately intertwined, right? They both want us to see the way in which there's a form that's operative and that we're being blinded by the content, right? Like they're both talking about radically different things, but I think they're both saying, like for Marx, there's a form of the commodity and you're letting the content of the commodity blind you to the form. And for Freud, it's like there's a formal structure to subjectivity and you're letting this content of symbolic identity blind you to the formal structure of subjectivity in the unconscious. So I think to me, that formal idea is really important. Right. Yeah. Okay. I was last thing I'm going to ask you about is basically I've been listening to a little bit of your speaking on universalism and identity. Yeah. And I was thinking about that in relationship to contradiction, and contradiction again back to radical otherness in the subject. Yeah. But also the idea that race and racism, in a sense, in relationship to left wing and right wing, universalism is left wing and particularism. Identity politics is actually right wing, and we kind of don't think about it like that at all. We kind of think about it as the opposite. I know. I know. So therefore, you end up with getting Žižek. What's the guy he debated with? Jordan Peterson. Yeah, exactly. And Jordan Peterson saying everything, all that identity politics is left wing. And we don't need it. Yeah. But I thought that was a really good reading, actually, to think about it in terms of universalism as left and identity politics as right. So but going on that, I just wanted to say to you, and can we see race and racism and struggles there as an expression of Hegel's idea of the concrete universal? Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Like, I think, to me, Black Lives Matter would be a great example of the concrete universalism, right? So I absolutely think that. And I think that racism is always identity politics, right? Like racism is always about advancing a certain identity against other, and it needs this opposition. it can't be, obviously a racist position can never be universalist, right? Because it needs that racial other that it's excluding. So I think that that's really important. Whereas, and I think this, I think this is really fascinating. And if you think about, I like to contrast the way that just the slogans of the Black Lives Matter movement versus the slogans of these right-wing movements. And so the right-wing movements, like, again, this is in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, right? So they obviously can't have Jews join the group because they need them as the enemy. Whereas the Black Lives Matter movement, there's all things like I can't breathe, right? Hands up, don't shoot. All these things that like everyone can join in. So even though this didn't happen that often, it did happen that police would turn and like join part of the protest, right? Because it was inherently universalist. So like, and you couldn't imagine in Charlottesville, like a Jew could not join the group. It's structurally impossible. And I think that to me is really interesting about the different relationship between universality, which is, I think, anti-racism is inherently universalist, and then the particularism of racism.
Yeah, but it has kind of got a beautiful clarity to.
Yeah. I think to me, I mean, maybe it's too simple in the way I can.
But I also think that it can be useful because when you think about this, there's this kind of depoliticizing liberal language which says there is no right wing and left wing anymore.
Yeah, I'm totally against that.
Yeah, so am I. That's what I'm saying. That's what. In a way, there is the universal and there is identity politics.
Right.
And in a way, what you are addressing with that is that's why I find it kind of has a beautiful sort of almost kind of poetry to it.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, what made me write the book though was that this is Universality and Identity Politics. Is that I was just so. I just kept this attack on the left as identity politics. I was just like, wait a minute, no. Like anti-racism is not identity politics. And I think that is so essential to drum home that it's not, that this isn't, anti-racism is not identity politics. It's a universalist position, right? And so I think that's.
But of course it can be hijacked.
Right, that is absolutely true. Right, it's absolutely true that it can be hijacked by a kind of identity politics. And then it becomes a right-wing phenomenon, right? Like then it does.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, and that's why I think it's so important to see that distinction between universalizing, between universal and identity formation.
I think it's a key thing, and I also like what you said about contradiction, right? Like universality only emerges out of contradiction, both the subject's contradiction with itself, and to come back to your point you raised in terms of Jennifer Friedlander's essay, the contradiction in the other, right? Like the racists can see the contradiction in themselves. What they can't see is the contradiction in the other, right? So that's right. I think a crucial thing to get to universality. You have to see the universality of contradiction. I would say. And
you have to kind of meet that with the lack in your own subject. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Great.
I was thinking. You mentioned you refer to Sheldon George's in Trauma and Race, that you talk about that, you quote him in saying that it is ultimately jouissance that grounds difference, establishing this difference through its circumscription of the fantasy object. Now, what do we really mean by that? So jouissance. So I'm trying to grab at how jouissance operates to ground difference specifically. Like, what do we mean by, or how is it that you're emphasizing this importance of in this extreme level of enjoyment? I'm just going to accent that.
That for sure. Yeah.
And how that establishes difference specifically around the fantasy object, like how that it's a sort of a minor, I know, mechanism, but it's a very, I think, important one.
No, I don't think it's minor at all, Andrew. I think you're really right to point out, right? It's crucial. So it's precisely this overinvestment of the racial other with a capacity to enjoy, or to enjoy excessive, to be excessive, right? To jouir, to like that. Mm-hmm. That capacity is what establishes the difference, right? Like it's not like, oh, there are these just different races that exist. No. Like they get established through the relation to enjoyment, right? Like think about the way in
So like
which
Trump being racist about Mexican rapists.
that's right, exactly, right? Like
Mexican rapists.
there's no such thing. There's no like, we're all just human, right? Like there's no, how do you make the distinction? Well, it's not by the border between the countries. No, it's by, they have the ones coming up that have this special kind of horrific enjoyment. That's the racial other. That's what he's saying when he makes that statement. And I think that's how race gets delineated, right? It's not delineated by borders or by, you know, like skin color. Like obviously it couldn't be skin color, right? Like there's too many variations within to constitute the variation, the distinction from without. So I think it has to be this like, does that person get assigned a certain kind of relation to jouissance or enjoyment, or do they not? And I think that's how race gets established.
That's the consistent, important structure.
That's right. That's right.
So when
that's
we're talking about the things about Jews, it's because of these qualities that are assigned.
Exactly. Right. Like, you know, Hitler, I don't know if I quote this in the essay, but Hitler in Mein Kampf talks about the satanic joy of the Jew as he's seducing the young German Fräulein, right? Like that's what constitutes that figure as a Jew for the anti-Semite.
But isn't there a legitimacy of the law operating here as well?
That's right.
So for the subject, they're kind of legitimated by the law, and the other's enjoyment is therefore criminalized.
It's extra legal, right? It's extra. It's always. I think that's a great point. That it has to be criminal enjoyment, right? Like even if it does somehow fit within the confines of legality, it's kind of getting around the law in some way, right? Like that's how that racial others enjoyment has to be characterized.
And this is where some of the language used by certain hip hop artists, not all, but some, that idea of really totally identifying with this kind of excess criminal enjoyment, which young white dudes can get off on.
Well, not only that, Edna, but like they're the main consumers of that, right? Like my boys have a lot of white friends. They're twins and they're seniors in high school. And this to me, it's just like it's the epitome of what I'm talking. So with one of my twin sons, I was down at the gym shooting baskets, and these, maybe it must have been like, I don't know, like five young suburban white guys blast some hip hop song, right? And it's like, and they're like the set of the like the misogynistic violence of the song and the criminality of the acts depicted in the song were incredible, and yet no one said anything. Like the people in charge of the gym, they're fine. It's fine. It's like, why? Because it buys into the fantasy, right? Like that music fits into the fantasy of the way, the racist fantasy of what Black youth, blah blah blah, how they enjoy, and so it's isn't acceptable.
Yeah, isn't there a kind of intent there? Which the intent is that yes, we are celebrating this illegitimate enjoyment. Yeah. But in a sense, I think Žižek's critique of that would be something like that's a perverse, you know.
No, absolutely, right. Like, they're getting off on, but that's why it's completely like it's a perfect kind of position, right? Because you can tell yourself, I can't be a racist because I'm listening to Black hip hop music, so clearly I'm not a racist. And yet you're getting off on precisely the racist fantasy of putting the other in the position of like criminal enjoyment and guardian of that enjoyment.
So right? The disavowal operates on the level of
absolutely.
And the unconscious enjoyment that you have no responsibility for it. That's the structure you're actually enjoying.
Right. It gets back to that idea of taking responsibility for your enjoyment.
I wonder whether it's quite. I mean, I wonder because I know that Alenka and Slavoj try to debate this problem with the what does he call? What does Slavoj talk about with the new leadership? Embodied by Trump. That is to say, he's sort of slippery. It's not that he is exactly represent. Like one minute he's saying some racist thing, the next minute he's like, oh, but I love all Mexicans. They're fantastic. Yeah. This kind of constant. It's not like the 1950s. Right. It's a different sort of as he said, the ultimate postmodern thing. But Alenka gets into it in a whole different, Alenka Zupančič gets into a whole different complicated dialectic about the problem of that there's no way that we can anchor where the social authority is because of this new regime. It becomes a very different kind of problem now. So it related to my thinking as remembering listening to a man who was speaking very Islamophobic discourse. And it was a very confusing discourse. So I was kind of not sure if he really meant it or if he was doing this kind of Trumpian language, which is very exaggerated, almost a parody, almost self-parody style, almost provocative on purpose to get attention and tempt you. Where do you identify or not? Am I going to now fight back like a leftist? And am I now going to play psychoanalytic role of like, hey, Stephen, do you really believe that? Or it's a sort of a different social link that's being provoked, like with somebody like Trump when he's playing, it seems like in the 1960s.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. And it's a little hard to grip as to what that, I mean, I still think it is structurally racist, don't get me wrong. Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is it's operating on a slightly different mechanism that I think does have something to do with what I would call capitalist discourse, but it's also seems to work on a hysteric register. But at the same time, it also reminds me there's this, what is his name? This philosopher who was mentored by Badiou, I'm sure you know his name, who had a big
Yeah.
And he writes about parody of the self-parody as an important, almost not primordial, but a certain part of the subjectivity. There's this parody structure because of, I forget how he gets into it, but that we are prone to a kind of excess of self that I forgot how he develops that, but it's a very important part of his thinking and very interesting, this excess that works in a sort of parody structure. And thinking about this man talking this kind of crazy Islamic language, which again had a humorous aspect. It wasn't entirely serious. It had that kind of Trumpian discourse to it, which leaves a kind of strange, what Zupančič has tried to debate. Like where do we then locate that? Like it's sort of a, and it reminds me a little bit, sorry, I'm going off here a little bit, a lot for you to discuss, but it reminds me a little bit of what you talked about, the lynch parties. It's not the same, but that there was this excess kind of enjoyment at the lynch parties through I think the 40s in America, maybe it was the 40s or 50s, I'm not sure. But I think, again, it was different, but it does make, because it's very contemporary, I think, that you have this kind of strange, I certainly think it's right wing, but it has a kind of provocative, humorous, not humorous, mercurial quality to it, that it can't be pushed as it's on purpose as racist or Islamophobic. And yet it is operating in this provocative way. I don't know quite how, I wonder what you think about how, I know, like, again, Alenka tried to debate this problem of how can we deal with this issue now, because it's very difficult. I mean, Trump is almost a master of that.
I agree. Yeah, and it's a good question. I mean, to me, I think it has to, like, isn't what he does really well is that he leaves open the space for disavowal in a way that was impossible before. And I think that's the key. Like, I think today that, like, disavowal is I guess for me, really the fundamental mode of symbolic identity, right? Like you enjoy the racism, but you disavow it. Like, I think the Trump supporter, they get the enjoyment, but then, because you're right, like, is it a joke? Is it not a joke? Like, then there's always much more room, I think, to disavow your relation to the enjoyment, right? And I think that I think that disavowal is absolutely crucial for the enjoyment, right? Like, you couldn't, like, if you had to embrace it yourself, I mean, I think I guess to me, that's there in racism all along. So it's interesting that you bring up the lynching party, because that even there, I think you have to have, to some extent, some kind of disavowal operative, like because in racism, you don't have to take responsibility for your own enjoyment. So it's as if Trump, like, amps up the disavowal, but the structure underneath is remaining the same. I think that's all I would say. Yeah. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll go again. So, Todd, in your essay, you emphasize that what is pivotal in the fantasy is not the object of the fantasy, but the object basically could be any object.
Yeah.
But I wanted to kind of just to add to that is that
yeah.
the object of abstraction in the fantasy too can also be any object.
Correct.
Right? And that brings us to another idea of the fungibility of race and the racial other.
That's right. That's right. It could be anything. That's absolutely right. And it's interesting because wouldn't the real step forward be to see the way in which the object is already its own obstacle? That is that every object is fundamentally ungettable, unattainable, right? And so you don't even need to erect the obstacle because you've already got that unattainability inherent in every object of desire, right? Like that.
Yeah.
And I think
that's how object operates. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. I was just going to say that Lacan invents this term objet a to explain, and he distinguishes it very importantly between the objet a, which is the object cause of desire, subject that drives us to desire, and the object of desire. But you could say that that's actually a split within the object itself. So it's split between its objet a-ness and its object of desire-ness, right? And so the objet a-ness is the inaccessibility of the object of desire. So it's the thing that makes it fundamentally inaccessible. And I think that like, it's the thing that stains the object from, what's interesting is it stains it from being perfect, right? Like so you would think what drives us to desire an object would be the thing that makes it perfect. But Lacan's point is actually the opposite. It's the thing that just stops it from being perfect, that drives us to desire that object of desire. So it's and I think that's where you can see the way in which race and racism function relative to that object of desire. But I think it's absolutely important what Enda said, that it can't be, it doesn't matter what the obstacle is. So that's why the fungibility of race is really, I think, important.
I think we lost Enda here.
I think we did. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we should. I had a thought earlier which had to do with the issue of the movement of anti-racism, and that is to say, wait, what was my thought? Oh, I'm wondering what you thought about the way that Lacan thinks about the four-da game and how he differentiates from, Freud's thoughts, which is, he makes this complaint that if we were to understand, and he's being rather literalist, but that Freud's reading essentially comes down to that the child could just as well cry, but that there's a much more complicated process going on there where, in a sense, to simplify, the child is getting the first steps of what we might call mastery. Like there's a certain sense where and it comes with a kind of difficult process, which includes this enjoyment, this joyous action of like, there it is, now it's here, back and forth, and involves repetition. That's where I'm trying to get to. So there's a kind of action of repetition whereby you have a certain sense of control of objects around you. And then you're able to start to feel a certain idea, I guess I'm talking in very general terms here, certain autonomy from this mother figure who can cause happiness and pain. I mean, that's why I think Lacan is arguing it's a different thing than what Freud seemed to imagine.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether this gets me to a point of whether or not, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, whether in the movement of anti-racism, it's not really, the problem you were talking about earlier is how to venture this issue of like that from this kind of Lacanian point of view. You don't want to just get to this like colorblind position, nor a position of over emphasizing the sedimentation of racial structures. So does that leave then the presentation of the subject as in a place of a kind of ironic distance, something like a Kafka-esque, because then we still have the Gregory becoming a cockroach. I mean, he's aware, but and there's an ironic writing of the story, but he doesn't go beyond being stuck in the room as a cockroach.
Right.
That's our portrait. It's a dark portrait of his separation. you know, and it's very ironic and such, but there's no real liberation there. There's no, you know, I mean,
yeah, right.
So I love Kafka, but I wouldn't call, it's hard to find a point of liberation in Kafka.
No, there's not. It's funny because, you know, when Wells made his film of the trial, he had to change it, right? Like he had to make, like, Joseph K. kind of becomes liberated from the thing at the end and from their control and refuses to, like, take the knife into himself. But unlike Joseph K. in the novel, so I think you're right. Like Kafka can't envision that liberation, but I think that I guess I don't think it's impossible to envision it. And I just would come back to this idea of, like, what can't Gregor do? He can't see the way in which he already is the cockroach, right? Like he can't, like he can't see himself in his alienation. Right?
You know, there's a hysterical line in it when he wakes up with, and he knows he's a cockroach, and he says, "Oh, this is a great day for me to organize the closet." You know?
right. Which is exactly the point, right? Like he constantly is forgetting what he's capable of because of the alienated state that he's in, right? And I think that's, to me, that's really the key thing. Like, can you embrace your alienation as what is constitutive of you? Which he doesn't, which I don't think someone does that in Kafka. I mean, interestingly, maybe in like Hunger Artist or something, but I think I don't know that anyone is capable of it in Kafka, but I do think that is the idea, right? That, like, that's the anti-racist project, is to see alienation not as what we need a cure for, but as what's constitutive of subjectivity within society. And I think that, to me, that's the core of any anti-racist project.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, I guess it'd be a good idea that we should take some questions now.
That'd be great.
And I think Charlotte, perhaps you can open that up. I don't have the technical controls here, so I suppose, are you there, Charlotte? Yeah. I wonder what happened to Edna. Somebody wrote questions from E.B. Anderson. Let's see. I guess we don't have the audio yet of things, but I'll just ask then. Okay. The question is identity politics, is it a right-wing phenomenon?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's totally my position. That to see one's particular identity as the source of one's political position is, to me, that's inherently right-wing, right? Because it can't be universal. It can't champion anything like solidarity because it has something in the way of solidarity. It can't champion equality. It can't any of these things precisely because the insistence on one particular identity requires an enemy, right? It requires someone who is a threat to that identity. Otherwise, the identity is meaningless, right? So for me, that's what makes identity politics inherently right-wing, that it buys into this Carl Schmittian idea of the friend and enemy, right? Like it constitutes itself in that way, whereas to me, a left-wing politics has to be at least open to the possibility of everyone being part of it.
But isn't that, I'm going to play the devil's advocate.
Good.
Okay. So I just want to go refer to I don't know why, but for some reason, some people think it's very controversial, Marx's essay on the Jewish question, the famous On the Jewish Question. Mm-hmm. And in that, from the way I read it, he is critical, but defending at the time, this is 1860s or so, there was a movement of defending the rights and powers of Jewish people in various different countries in Europe, just to make it clear to the audience. And there were different reformist movements at the time in Holland, France, in different ways to protect the rights and citizenship of Jewish people in different states. I don't know the exact states. I think England as well. In any case, he wrote an article. It's very Aristotelian in many ways, if I think so, where he was in some ways critical of it, but he basically identifies it. If I read it, I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong, but my memory of it is that he argues that it's basically reformist. It can only go so far. And he argues that it is not universalist, but he's not like making a slam on it. Like he's not quite calling it, if I remember right, like not quite calling it right wing exactly. He calls it limited, if I remember right. Like he's critical of it, that it's not going to, and he uses Aristotelian kind of categories of the way of understanding it. Like it's not quite in, I forget these Aristotelian terms, like the species, man species, human species levels. And so it's not up in the level of the cosmic or the universal, because it's just about a particular group, which he being Jewish, he's not, you know, but he doesn't get into that. He's just more that he understands why it's important. Like people are being oppressed, and so they need to be defended for their rights to be regular citizens. But he makes an argument that it's not universalist enough. So I just want to introduce that, because I think that in some regards, the history of identity, what is the name of the group, that the Black lesbian group in the 70s?
Yeah, the River Collective.
Yes, right. Who, as you know, many of the leadership of that group have subsequently said that what they were advocating, they were Marxists, was not for a structure of identity politics that would be sort of inherently antagonistic to each other's groups. It was about grouping with other groups, white or whatever, progressive groups, to go further in representing people. But it did have an idea of, like, we as, in their case, lesbian Black women that were progressive and radical politically, need to come together as such to form an alliance for each other's concerns and interests as such. And I guess, so I wonder how you comment on that, because in a way, identity politics, I agree with what you're saying, but my point is that there's other strains in this kind of historical development whereby what is looped, or not looped, but thrown into the term identity politics involves also this kind of problem. I think it has to do with the capitalist developments that have occurred, that you have this fragmentary society.
Yeah.
That you now have, so that there is, but I can understand, really coming from Marx's point of view, that it is a kind of a problem that some people do need to defend and come together as within ethnic groups and gender groups and different kinds of groups to defend their, their rights, let's say.
No, absolutely, Andrew. Yeah, I think it's a great, so just a little couple things on the Jewish question, right? Like, so the end of that essay, Marx says, we don't need to emancipate Jews from the society, we need to emancipate society from Judaism. So he really, he's pretty, you're right, he's not totally hostile, but he's pretty hostile to that movement.
Yeah, that's right.
But what I would say is that he doesn't understand the way in which that movement for the rights of a certain oppressed people, to me, that is universalist, right? Because it's, what is it saying? It's saying, and I think this is what the collective statement is all about. Like, if you read the statement itself, it doesn't seem anything like what we know as identity politics today. And as you pointed out, like, that's why some of the leaders of that group have distanced themselves from identity politics as it's practiced. So I think that like, to insist upon the rights or the equality of a group that's oppressed, that to me is not identity politics. That is universalist politics, precisely because it's done in the name of universal equality, right? Like, this group is oppressed because we believe in universal equality. We can't allow that oppression to go on. So that seems to me a far different thing than saying, what matters is the power of this particular group relative to every other group. Like, that seems to me to be a very anti-universalist way to, for lack of a better word, like Foucauldian, Nietzschean kind of way to interpret the political scene. So that's what I would say. I would just say those things that even if those groups imagine themselves engaged in identity politics, I wouldn't call it that. I think because there's this appeal to universal equality, it's inherently universalist.
I see. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. I think Mike wants to now ask a question. Yeah. Michael.
Yeah, hi, Todd. Yeah. I was thinking about how in terms of race being seen as a barrier or stealing enjoyment, and in the chapter when you're talking about sort of the black man and being very sexualized and potent and aggressive. And that would be sort of the context in terms of America, but that maybe the mechanism that you've been talking about sort of maybe in terms more universal, but then here in South Africa, would part of the work then be engaging in terms of how that becomes represented here, which would be a different version.
Absolutely right. Like the obstacle can take it. Like think about how different it is. I mean, I don't know the situation in South Africa. I know the situation in Europe pretty well. Like the way in which it's functioning in like France and Germany right now. Like the way, like the obstacle is clearly identified with Islam, right? Like it seems much more identified than it is in, say, the United States. And then I think about the way in which, even in China, I think the way this same kind of fantasy is structured, and it's again, Islam is the target, right? Like, so I think I think you're right. Like that's part of what it means to understand the way in which racism is working in different ways. And I think it involves seeing the way in which the form has a different content in these different areas. You know, different groups get inserted in the different positions, right? I think that happens for sure.
Yeah. So then part of the work, like a work in analysis, it would be like here with the ideas to start to, I suppose, interrogate how this sits in our minds. And you know, which I think it sounds like you've been doing in the States or starting to do.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, look, I think again, like part of what I do, this isn't an essay, but in the larger book, like I look at the way in which this manifests itself totally differently in different places, right? Like, but you can still see the same underlying formal structure, which I think is what needs to be interpreted.
In South Africa, a lot of the theory around race has been coming in from a more object relations Kleinian perspective. So it's in terms of massive anxiety and splitting projective identification. So it's not, I think the Lacanian view puts in quite a nice different way to start to look at it and think about it.
Yeah, it is different. That's true.
Which is nice. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi Todd, I have a
hi Devin
for you. Hi. So I wrote it up on the chat. I'm just going to read it off. I'm curious as to your thoughts regarding your Lacanian readings on race around current claims that the white working class is currently the foremost racialized subject via contemporary forms of anti-racist discourse in order to rationalize and continue the impacts of deindustrialization, to continue the effects of social division, to continue bipartisanship. So in essence, I'm curious if you feel like the Lacanian reading can actually apply to the white working class subject, and if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess I can see that. I mean, I can see why someone would say that. I guess for me, it's important to sustain the distinction between racism and class exploitation, right? And I think that because I think the problem with that analysis is I think that it erases the way in which the white working class is being is being like a real racist fantasy is part of that, part of the way in which that othering or whatever you're going to call it is working, right? So I think that you got it. That's why I think you have to think the two together. But I think you're absolutely right that there's a real sense in which, and I think this is, in America, there's like commentators that think, well, the left should just, I almost couldn't believe I read this, like that the left should just abandon the white working class. I'm like, well, that seems like a very strange leftist position to take up, right? Like it's certainly not a Marxist position, but anyway, so I mean, I don't think it's a minority. I mean, I don't think it's the majority position, but I think I think a lot of people have that. So I think, to me, one of the crux of the issue is thinking about the way in which, I mean, part of what I'm trying to say is that about thinking about racism in terms of fantasy is to think that, like, I think this is one of the real errors, is to think like, oh, it's more of a white working class, poor white prop. Like, I don't think that at all. Like, I think it's absolutely cross class problem. But I do think, like, thinking the relationship between capitalism and racism is always the crucial thing. Like, I don't think you should ever think about racism outside of that relation to capitalism, which I think is what your question's kind of getting at. Like, how do those two things, how are they working together? And I think, you know, part of what I would say is the more that you are thrown out of the capitalist fantasy, the more you need to be fed the racist fantasy. That's what I would say is one thing that's happening to the white working class right now.
Mhm.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I think we have another question here from Greg. If Greg wants to come on video or not, I'm not sure, or I can ask the question. Okay, I'll just ask the question. It's he puts that he's being slightly ironic, and it's that he's provoking a politically correct other. Isn't it so that universalist anti-racism shouldn't succumb to take the bait with PC moralism? And doesn't this dynamic enhance each other? So how to overcome this?
No, I don't find that necessarily provocative. I mean, I think that's probably right. Like there is a way, like anti-racism, like I had a student say to me, every day I think to myself, what racist thoughts do I have that I need to get rid of? And I said, look, I don't think you're really helping the anti-racist project with that daily activity, I have to say. So I think that's I don't disagree with that. Like, I think that they're like a heightened kind of correctness. I don't see why to me, that does not coincide with a universalist anti-racism, right? Like, I think that like a heightened sense of like, we have to be totally correct. I don't think that because the problem is that I think that becomes super egoic. And I think once the struggle against racism tips over into this super egoic pressure, then I think it's really lost.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another question from Ray. Ray, would you like to speak, or I could just ask it? It's either way. I'll just give him a moment. Okay, I'll just ask it. So what are your thoughts on the current BIPOC, which is the Black Indigenous People of Color movement? And is this creating another binary externally or even set of structured absences internally by focusing on color? How would a Lacanian reading or theory work in terms of progressive ways in redressing imbalances in the workplace instead of, as it was put earlier, simply replacing previous racist structures forms with current ones?
Yeah, I guess I don't care so much about the terminology. Like, to me, whatever the terminology is, I mean, obviously, using racist terms is not a good thing, but in terms of like people of color, whatever, I don't think that necessarily matters. But I think what the key thing is, and I think this is really important, is that we shouldn't think, and I think this is what the question's getting at, that we shouldn't think that race is itself generative of racism, right? Like the point is to think about it, and this, I'm totally indebted to Karen and Barbara Fields, their book Racecraft on this subject. I think it's the absolute best book ever written on racism. But their point is that racism, we always need to be thinking that it's racism that generates our racial categories or our racial distinctions. And so for them, this is the problem, even with something like biracial, because it suggests that there's somehow some kind of, there's some kind of race that exists, and then there's some kind of breeding with it. Like, their point is, no, like, race is always generated just by some racist act. And every time you see race, you should be thinking about the way in which it's generated only through the racist act. So I think that that's, if whatever the term is, I think that if it puts the focus on the racist act, then that and the racist structure, rather than on race. I think that's a really important, that is the fundamentally important thing.
We have another question. Sergio, if you could ask yourself, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you, Todd. We wrote a few emails. I translate your work on the animality in racism, and I want to ask you something from that.
There. Oh wait.
We can't hear you, Sergio. Yeah.
Hi, now?
Yeah, now it's good.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we wrote a few emails. I translated word from you, and I want to ask you something that perhaps you just mentioned, that you don't really care about terminology. But I want to ask you, how do you see these articulations between anti-racism and other forms of, let's say, discrimination, which do not fall under that category, but perhaps at least in a few papers of you might put it in the same bag, like anti-Semitism or sexism, because perhaps like common people might recognize this is not an anti-racism attitude, but a sexist attitude. But which is the difference actually? I mean, if I hate Jews, does that make me a racist? Is Judaism a race? I mean, perhaps you do not agree with being such an obsessive with terminology, but I would like to know what are your thoughts in that, and what is the theoretical or political consequences of mixing in the same bag sexism, anti-Semitism, anti-racism, racism, and that stuff. I mean, how would you position these different attitudes? That's my question.
Yeah, Sergio, it's a good question. So a lot of people who theorize racism, anti-Semitism want to keep them apart. I do not. Like, I think anti-Semitism is just racism. Like, I don't think it's something separate. I don't think it's different. And so a lot of, in the larger book project, a lot of my examples are from anti-Semitism, and I just think it's actually totally the same as racism, and I don't think there's a danger in that, in thinking of them together. Sexism is a little more interesting to me. Like, it's a little more, and I think someone like Joan Kopchak, in a book called Read My Desire, she talks about, she wants this, on Lacanian grounds, she wants to distinguish between racism and sexism totally, right? Because she thinks sexism is a response to retreating from sexual difference and retreating from the implication of sexual difference, and racism is about symbolic differences, whereas sexual difference is real. I'm not sure that I totally buy that. Like, I kind of think that race, basically the same racist fantasy, kind of, the difference is, I think, with sexism is that it's not just the obstacle, it's the object itself that is thought to contain the enjoyment. And Andrew, it comes back to the question you raised about porn, I think, right? Like is porn operative in the same way? But I think the only difference is that with sexism, it's the enjoyment within the object, and that's somehow inaccessible, right? So it's more about, the slight difference, I would say, is that sexism is more about the inaccessibility of the object rather than the obstacle that's placed before the object. So that's a slight difference, I would say. But I don't think it's that extreme of a difference. I think the basic fantasy structure is operative in both cases.
Okay. I think, Edna, you're back. I thought you were back.
No, just on the last point, Andrew. On your last point, Todd.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that, sexism and racism, and in relationship to belonging and non-belonging.
Yeah.
Would you be able to kind of look at that in terms of belonging?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, the way that Lacan in Seminar 20 theorizes feminine subjectivity is as a subjectivity of non-belonging, basically, like the notion of the non-all, whereas male subjectivity is about it's about like you belong because you're through this figure of the exception, right? And the feminine side for Lacan lacks the exception. So I do think that, in a way, retreat from non-belonging, sexism, you could say, I think in those terms, is this retreat from non-belonging in the way that racism too is too. But I think the difference is that again, I think that there's a slight difference, that the non-belonging is thought of as inherent in female subjectivity, whereas in the case of racism, it's that the racial other is the barrier to getting the object. So there's I just think there's a slight difference, but basically I think it's the same. And I think in both cases, sexism and racism retreat from this fact of non-belonging.
Okay, but in Lacan as well, there's a difference, isn't there, between the...
I think that's what I was saying about when I brought up Joan. I think for Lacan, there would be a much more extreme difference between sexism and racism than I would be wanting to grant.
Yeah, it's also because we're talking about woman and man, and these are positions in Lacan which are not...
Right, they're structural positions, they're not biological identities, right?
Yeah, or they're not gender, rather.
Not gender.
Yeah. So what about that? What about Sheldon George's positioning of race as the object?
Well, the other thing he's going to do in his next book is he's going to link the racial other to female subjectivity. So he's going to kind of make that connection fully.
That makes sense.
Fully. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it opens up a discussion that Edna and I've had it's an ongoing debate around the way in which Lacan developed, the feminine's response and also the other's response, and whether or not we sometimes debate whether or not he should have even developed the feminine's response in quite the way he did, and rather than just have the other's response and et cetera. It's a long discussion.
Yeah, let's just put that to Todd just quite quickly, Todd.
Right. Where does Todd sit on that? But
yeah, this is a Todd. You did a talk with, I think his name is Guy Le
Goffey.
Yeah,
Guy Le Goffey, and he talked about. Brilliant. Yeah, he talked about the failure of logic in Lacan.
Yeah,
but when he mentions the feminine jouissance, he's going back to the logic of one.
I know. And he is very critical of this invention of two jouissances, right? Like he thinks he's absolutely against. Yeah, and so it really puts him at odds with, he lives in France, so he's at odds with most of his compatriots. So, but I agree with Guy on that. Actually, I'm firmly in his camp that I think that was a misstep. Although I do think that the advantage gained by it into this like theorization of the non-all was great, right? I think that this invention of feminine, this other kind of this new category of jouissance associated with the feminine, I'm not for that, but I do think that grasping the structure of subjectivity through the non-all, I think, was a really incredible breakthrough.
But I think the feminine always implies the masculine, and therefore it goes back to the binary, and also it leaves it open to a reading from a sociological
perspective. That is exactly right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's Guy's point. And Guy actually had a series of polemics with Jean-Claude Milner over this very question.
Right.
So, although I don't know that I think it was just discussions. I don't think they were ever.
Okay, myself and Andrew have been bashing over this for quite some time.
I don't agree with this one. I'm faithful to Lacan on this one. All right. Well, thank you, Todd, very much. There was something I wanted to mention. I wanted to ask you, what are you working on? And you have a book coming up that it goes further into the issue of the obstacle, because that's very interesting. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I know we've talked too long, so I don't want to push you.
So that book is The Racist Fantasy, and that's going to come out at the end of the year with Bloomsbury. And then I have this book I'm doing. I was going to do with Zero Books, but that fell through. So now it's going to come out. I don't know who's coming out with, some new place, but it's called Enjoying Right and Left. And so it's really about, and then there's kind of some of the things we're talking about universalism, but it structures that in terms of an argument about enjoyment. And so it actually also touches on this only one form of enjoyment. So,
yeah.
So it has that. So it's, yeah. So anyway, so that's the next thing.
Yeah. Wait, we have one last little question that came in. Greg wants to ask, he meant that usually it is the right who's provoking hysterically a PC other, and that some kind of supposed anti-racism who jumps on that is just the other side of the same coin. Todd wrote, only a joke can save us. Does he see some emancipatory solidarity potential in comedy vis-a-vis racism, perhaps?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Although I'm not sure that I take, Slavoj Žižek's view is we need to share racist jokes and then that'll, that's not exactly my position. Although, but I do think like we need better anti-racist jokes. Like my book on racism has like 3 or 4, but they're not, I mean, they're pretty good, but that I do think that like that it is, I don't think it's right that, or I don't think it's true that racist jokes are funnier, right? Like I think they're usually not as funny as a good anti-racist joke. So I think that's like, I do think like that part of what anti-racism has to do is to mobilize enjoyment on the side of anti-racism. So if that, and one of the ways that happens is through comedy. So it is not my view with Slavoj that we share, although I don't see a problem with it in private. Like people share, like my two sons their twins are Jewish, and they're constantly making anti-Semitic jokes to each other and to their friends, right? So, and that's one of the ways that they bond with their friends. And so that seems, I think that seems totally fine, but I don't think they should be obviously publicly parading around anti-Semitic jokes, even if they're Jewish, right? So I guess that to me, it's not necessary, like, part of the anti-racist, just like I said, part of the anti-racist struggle is comic. It's comic, but it's not, but I don't think it means, taking up racist jokes, unless you're going to twist them,
Just a side note, the person that I was mentioning just before, is not Milisu, it's Kasim. It doesn't matter.
Oh, Kasim. Okay.
Yeah, Kasim. Anyway, well, thank you, Todd, very much. It's been a really, really interesting discussion, and a lot to think about. Really, really, and so we wish you the best. It was really,
well.
Really
thanks for having me. I had a great time talking with you too, and thanks for spending so much time talking with me.